You're listening to an IOE podcast.
Powered by UCL Minds.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Research Ethics Conversation series. Today, I'm thrilled to have Dr. Sara Young with us. Sara is a lecturer at the Institute of Education, University College London. Hello, Sara.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us in today's conversation. So I find your research truly fascinating, Sara, and particularly relevant to this conversation series because it tackles the issues of identity, issues of language, and issues of linguistic practices of children and young people, and particularly those coming from also some vulnerable profiles, probably in the immigration context. But you are also interested in the questions of ethics, if I'm correct. So over to you. Could you please give us the sense of your field of research?
Okay, thank you again for inviting me. And yes, I think that sort of what you've just said touches on the crux of really what I do, because what I'm interested in is working with children in migrant communities who often have very interesting experiences to share about their life experiences, their linguistic experiences, being at the Institute of Education, how they adapted to new school systems, how they adapted to their new environment, and what they have to say about this. But there are a lot of ethical issues, because they may be considered vulnerable on two counts. One is that they are under 18. And the other element is that they come from migrant communities. I suppose a third element might also be the language as well, which I sort of can touch on later, and how that in itself is a power relation if I don't speak the language that my participants do. And do we take on translators or do we rely on English? And that's perhaps a linguistics question, but it also has an ethical underpinning.
That's right. Well, all these aspects that you have mentioned, the fact that, your participants, your collaborators are very often under 18. And again, there are more people involved in the research process, such as the translators, as you have mentioned. And again, the identity profile, most of those children are coming from probably the migrant background, as you have said. And each of these aspects raise particular questions, but also altogether, it creates an environment that the researcher, I think, must be extremely careful, ensuring the prevention measures and ensuring that it's not risky, it's a safe environment. So what are the 2-3 most common ethical issues that you encounter in almost everyday basis in your research context? What are the most crucial issues that come to your mind when you think about your experience in the field?
I think I divide them into two, the beforehand and then the during. So beforehand, there are all the questions of the information sheet, of the consent forms, all of those things that we're obliged, obviously, to adhere to ethical guidelines. But how to introduce information sheets to children, where you need to put lots of information but keep it enough for them to be able to read. Again, I have the language element of what language do I use, and what may be understood in one language doesn't translate into another. We then have involvement of parents. Sometimes children, particularly older teenagers, don't really want to do things that their parents have given consent for. They like to see it as their own independent project. And so that requires some negotiation, perhaps with the school stepping in as a gatekeeper. And there are elements to negotiate there so that the children feel that they have some agency in what they're doing. So that's the beforehand. During, the sort of questions that come up, and I suppose one that leads right the way through always with children is the power relations. And so if that can be broken down a little bit when you're working on the information sheet, the consent, actually introducing the research, it then makes it much easier to come in and try and mitigate some of those power elements, of which language is one. During the research, I often find, particularly with adolescents, is that, and children as well, is they like to take the research in a different direction. You may have had one thing in your mind that you'd like to talk about. They want to talk about something else. Sometimes it's a little frustrating, perhaps, because ethically you've got in the back of your mind, we agreed to talk about these topics. And obviously talking about migration, there are some quite delicate issues that arise. But obviously in a form you'll need to have tried to anticipate and say, we will be touching on, for example, in my own work, we might be touching on bullying at school. We might be talking about anti-migrant hostility. These are quite difficult topics that I will already have discussed ethically. But the children might interpret this in a very different way, which is fascinating for the research. But it's that issue that I think anyone who does qualitative research has, particularly interviewing, that when the conversation takes another direction, there's part of your mind going, oh, wow. But part of your mind going, can I cover for this ethically? Can I use this data? Can you sign another form? Of course you can't. And so there's all of these sort of contradictory things going on in your mind. And I've had experience of working with this, which has been one of the challenges, but a fascinating challenge nonetheless.
That's very true. Well, that's really fascinating. I mean, you have touched upon some of the aspects that I wanted to hear more about. And you mentioned, for instance, the power relations, between you as a researcher, your own positionality within that space, and the children in front of you. And you also touched upon the aspect of agency when it comes, and children will love to show that they are there physically, mentally. They are the part of this conversation. They are not just there to provide you the data that you're looking for, but they would like to make a case and show their own voices very often, and particularly when it comes to the issues of probably migration, because they do have lots of experiences which sometimes sort of create an environment that may not be very ideal for them to raise their voices. But when a chance given, and in your research context, you provide that chance to them to speak up. So if the conversation, as you have mentioned, between you and then the children start to navigating towards different directions that, you may not have included in your ethics application. So what's your mitigation measure to that kind of unpredictable things or the movements during the fieldwork?
So I think the first thing is what you've just mentioned about agency. It feels very wrong on all sorts of levels to interrupt someone when they're talking, particularly a child if they're trying to tell you about an experience that they've had. And it's their agency to choose to tell me a certain story. I may then have to go away and decide not to use that story, which again is an ethical issue, but perhaps I feel it's oversensitive. Perhaps I feel that it reveals too much about their identity in terms of anonymity and those elements as well. What I've sometimes done with children, partly because they've just grabbed paper off me and said, what are your interview questions? What do you want to ask me? And if they want to have a look beforehand, and I think that's a great idea, if they can create something, if they can bring something in to talk about, if we have pictures, anything like that that gives them that sense of a voice. But I have sort of some direction over the ethics of it. And I think it is that sense of collaboration between giving young participants the agency to say what they would like to say or not, which is the other element. But also, I feel as researchers, there is a responsibility to be aware of the wider picture, the wider context that they operate in, and to protect aspects like who they are, where they come from, which school they attend, so that they're not exposed to further problems that they've already experienced. So I think it is a very, very fine line to sort of maintain all the way through. And sometimes it tips one way and sometimes it tips the other. There is that power relation. I think you can't deny it. And I think to try to pretend it isn't there is perhaps a little naive. But then sometimes the children are very much in control of adults as well, because they've taken on language brokering for their parents. So that's when they translate for their parents, because they've come to the country, they don't speak English. And the parents have got things like bank letters or medical statements or benefits, and they have no idea what's going on. And it's the child who takes over and goes, right, let me go and talk to school. Let me go and talk to the person at the bank. And they're taking on these very adult roles. So it's quite an interesting dynamic when another adult comes into it from a different institution, and you have to negotiate that different relationship. And so I very often, as I say, I've got sort of my responsibility hat on a little bit, but I'm quite happy if one of the participants wants to take over and start redesigning the questions to some extent, then that tells me something as well. I think that's the other element. I mean, the teenagers I worked with on a Polish project were very agentive, and that was part of the stories that they were trying to present. And I noticed that just in the way that they conducted the interviews, as I say, they conducted them, I was sort of there, and some of them were like, no, it's our interview. We're now going to talk about the following things. And that did give me an insight into the identities they were creating for themselves within their new communities. So I think it's very much a question of, as you said, different contexts and different experiences and different participants, and trying to go with it as much as you can, while at the same time just keeping in mind there is a responsibility there. And that's something I take quite seriously in terms of an ethical responsibility.
Right. Well, that's really fascinating. I mean, you touched upon, again, such important issues. And I think it was a wonderful strategy that you mentioned, that rather than trying to predict everything that is unpredictable, particularly in the qualitative research that's so slippery. And when it comes to the children, it might go any directions that you may not really foresee before. But you were saying that rather than trying to do so, you were, involving your participants as a co-researcher, if you like, collaborating with them and then asking them what they would like to talk about. That might be one way already to inform them about the topics that you'll be focusing on, and also ensure that their voices are being involved into the research design per se at the very beginning, rather than imposing the questions and extracting the data in a way. So that's really a wonderful way to also endorse, I think, the agency. You have also mentioned the issues of multi-party nature of your research, in the sense that it's not only children and you. So there are so many other individuals involved, including their legal guardians. They might be their parents. If they are unaccompanied, then it might be some social service worker, or the school might be doing that job. How does it work in an environment where there are so many voices and there are so many people that you have to ensure their consent in a way? For instance, when you're done with the interview, usually in the ethics application form, we mention and we just tick the box that we are going to share the accounts that we would like to use into our research analysis, for instance, with our participants. But in the case where there are more than one active participant in your research, including those that are ensuring the safety of the children, do you also run all these accounts with all the parties involved, or how does it work?
So this isn't something I've generally used. And I think there's a couple of reasons why I've stepped back from it. Partly it's because the challenge of working with children is that by the time you've collected data and you start analysing it and you start thinking what to do with it, they've gone into another school year, they've gone to another school, they may have moved, and doing a lot of back chasing pragmatically becomes a little bit challenging. I'm not saying it can't be done, but there is that element involved. I'm also quite wary of over-involving parents, schools, gatekeepers once I've been talking to children, because the moment that they know their parents are going to see what they've said, or that the school is reading transcripts, they start holding back. And right from the beginning, I often say with my research, I'm not interviewing parents. I may have a chat to the teacher, particularly if they're facilitating the research or recruiting in some way, but it's very much, what do the children want to say, away from people listening in? Again, that raises a sort of ethical issue of how do you speak to children individually in terms of safeguarding, but that's perhaps a pragmatic issue to discuss another time. But what I do try and do is put that emphasis on the fact that it is children's research, it's what they're saying, it's not being shared with parents until the final report, it's not being doctored or censored or any of those things that children become a little bit wary of. And again, that's to do with power relations. Because if you're doing research in a school, they're thinking, what does my teacher want me to say? What does my head teacher want me to say? What marks will I get? And so I have to go, no, it's nothing to do with any of that. This is just me talking to you about your experiences. This is not graded or anything in that element. Also, this is not something that your parents are involved with, apart from they've allowed me to talk to you about these things. Allows children that agency again. It hands it over to them rather than going, you're under the control of people around you.
Right, fantastic. Do you also once in a while, for instance, before you start the interview, let's sit together and then we are going to talk about this during the next 20 minutes. So here are my questions. Rather than that kind of sort of formulaic way of dealing with the interview, do you also start with a sort of informal conversation in advance with the children in order to accommodate, assist them to arrive to the moment that they feel comfortable? What are some of the preparation measures or like practices that you usually do in the field?
I think in the field, I do what you would do with anybody that you're having a conversation with. Hello, how are you? How's your day? How was the Easter holidays? How's the weather? How's school? What was your lesson? Just general conversation. Nothing to do with the research whatsoever. And I've actually found it has two benefits. Firstly, it does just break the ice again, because here I am again having another conversation. Also, I've actually found that participants have said more in those few minutes than they've said in the interview. I have an example of this is sort of been published, though I'm not divulging any information I shouldn't. I had one participant who, when I'd asked about her family, had told me one thing and led me to believe her family was living together. When I spoke to her, just how was your Easter holiday, or what are your plans for Easter? Or well, I'm going to visit my dad who's over there, my mum over there, and my grandmother in another country. And of course, they're separated. And that just came out of conversation rather than tell me about your family. So, as I say, it's twofold, the reasoning behind having that conversation beforehand.
Right, absolutely. Okay, fantastic. So, going back to that moment that you've mentioned that, some of the rich information, some of the very personal information that might be valuable also for your own research comes outside of these moments of recorded interviews, for instance, that during the chat, let's put it in that way. So I was particularly concerned about, or like curious about the questions of bullying. I mean, when I think about the profile of the students that you mentioned, there are so many issues of social cohesion, coexistence between the host community, between the migrant community. There are always some tensions going on, and sometimes the tensions go down, but sometimes really become inflamed, depending on the political context, broader context in a way. So during the interview, for instance, have you come across the moments where children your participants start to not to feel like continuing to interview or like take a break, if you like? And how do you deal with the moments like this where, you sense that the person in front of you started to suffering in a way because of the trauma, because of what happened just yesterday in the classroom, because the very person that poses or creates that tension just sitting next to him or her, because that might be the parents at the same time. So how do you deal with that very sort of sensitive moments?
So with those sensitive moments that come up, I think I'm always very conscious of moving on to something else. I'm not afraid to just stop the conversation and say, okay, thank you. Let's move on to a topic that's much lighter, for example, or something they may have mentioned previously and that we can return to as a sort of, oh, okay, let's talk about that really great maths exam you had last week. So what I might then do is come back to it. Again, I've had participants who have been very, very hesitant talking about bullying, for example, and saying, no, nothing happened to me. No, it was all fine. And then suddenly something comes out. And I will ask that question, do you want to tell me about it? Can you tell me more about it? Or would you rather not? And so there is always that option saying, well, you don't have to talk about these things. I also want to mention here the importance of just spatial positioning in a room where you're doing interviews, where you'll know you're going to talk about things like this. I've always tried to be in a room where the participant is closest to the door. So they always have that sense that if they did want to leave, they can choose to come in and leave as they want. I'm not sitting in the way. And so I think setting up the interviews to make the participant feel as far as possible that they have agency in the space, that they can leave, they can look out the window, hopefully if it's got a window in the room. All of these things play into it so that when something sensitive does come up, it's part of the atmosphere in the room to be able to say, should we stop there? Or would you like to take a break? Or do you want to carry on talking about this later? Or should we leave it? And sometimes, very often, they have returned to the topic of their own accord and said just a small amount, which is enough for me to say, this has been happening. I'm not a therapist. I'm not there to delve into trauma. I'm there to find out if it has been going on. It's almost enough to say, yes, it's been going on. Do you want to talk more about it? No. Okay, let's leave it. And others have. It's respecting the child, I suppose, as you'd respect anybody.
Perfect. I think that's the point I just wanted to say. Exactly. So respecting the person that you're having a conversation with. So instead of, even if we mention in our articles or in research reports that we call this semi-structured, in-depth interview, that with the very jargon, that's not an interview. Actually, that's a conversation between two individuals exploring some important issues. So that's really important to emphasize that aspect of respect, I think, from the very beginning. So now I would like to take you just one step before your research. Before we start our fieldwork, what we have to do is that we have to get the ethics approval, right? So we need to explain to our reviewers what we want to do, what kind of measures we have in place, and how we considered our ethical issues that might emerge from the field. So you have done, of course, that kind of ethics approval as well before you start your research. What would you like to say about that preparation process itself? Of course, that you always build upon the insights that comes from your previous research, but are there particular, let's say, the tips that you would like to share with the researcher with a similar interest and with a similar profile of people that they would like to collaborate in the field?
So I think the ethics application I find quite a useful process, because it allows me to get clarity on what it is exactly I'd like to do. And I'm having to explain it to the reviewers. So I'm explaining it to my peers, I'm explaining it to people who are also experts in the field, and receiving feedback that will help me make it a better project. So I mention everything that is of concern to me. And occasionally I have had other elements come back. Oh, yes, I hadn't thought of that, because we get involved with our own research and someone has a different perspective. So I think I find that whole process quite an enlightening process and a helpful way of articulating exactly what it is I'd like to find out, how I would like to do this, and what those issues are, so I can anticipate as many as I can in advance, rather than being stuck on the day thinking, I didn't think about this. So it allows me to think those things through with more clarity, because I have to write them down and explain them to someone who isn't involved in the research. It's different talking to a co-researcher, because they're as invested in it as you are, but having that objective external eye from someone who does understand but isn't invested in it is an extremely helpful process. And I always welcome comments coming back as to other areas I perhaps hadn't thought of.
Well, Sara, thank you so much for making the time to share those experiences and insights. We are almost arriving to the end of our conversation today. Just would like to ask you if there are anything else that you'd like to mention, you'd like to underline before we end the interview today.
Thank you. I think the one thing that I would just like to emphasize is that I find working on the ethical underpinnings of a project extremely enlightening for the way that I approach a project. And it will allow me to get that very rich data that we look for in qualitative research. So having thought those things through and explored the sensitivities of what I'm looking at is very much that first big step into understanding the project. So I think that for me, as well as the, of course, ethical obligations, there is an ethical value to research that we do, particularly with children, particularly qualitative. And so that whole process is actually enjoyable, because it means you're embarking on the project.
That's so true. I couldn't agree more about the final, the note that you made, Sarah. You were actually, just to reiterate, that's a very important point. You were just saying that ethics application or ethics approval is not just tick box that you are done, you just get the approval and you continue, but it's the integral part of the research. And then it's a research long process. At the same time, it changes as the research changes. Thank you very much again for your insights and all the valuable feedback. And hope to see you in the next interview, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast.